Hello, and welcome to this presentation looking at how we can manage soil organic carbon to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you for taking the time to sit down and listen to this presentation. My name is Neal, and I will be very happy to answer any questions you have when we meet at our next workshop. So, after setting the context around soil organic carbon, agriculture and climate change, I want to demonstrate how organic carbon contributes to nutrient efficient, low emission soils, the effects of soil type and management upon soil carbon sequestration, and also discuss the circumstances under which additions of organic matter to soil can be most effective. I want to start by considering the influence of human agriculture upon the amount of organic carbon stored in the world's soils. Now, this data is presented for publication in 2017 that aimed to model a world without agriculture and compare the difference in organic carbon to what we know is in soil at the moment. What it revealed was that over the last 1,200 years of human land use, there's been a deficit of about 133 gigatons of carbon in the top 2 meters of soil. The rate of loss has increased dramatically in the past 200 years, and that coincides really with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and, perhaps more importantly, the adoption of inorganic fertilizer as a way to maintain the fertility of soils. And coincident with that time and the reduction of organic inputs in soil, we see this sudden change in the acceleration really of the rate of loss of organic carbon from our soils. So we're now faced with this quite large deficit of organic carbon in our soils. There's actually a greater percentage of soil organic carbon losses from cropland, but since there's a much larger land area associated with grazing, in total there's a slightly greater loss due to grazing than there is for arable croplands. However, this means that we now have a great deficit to try and overcome in our soils, but increasing organic matter in our soils is a really good measure to address land degradation. And restoring degraded land helps improve resilience to climate change. And so soil organic carbon increases is a really important option for climate change adaptation. And there are estimates that we can probably sequester up to 8.6 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year if we manage soil in a very careful manner with consideration for organic carbon in the system. Now, the Paris Agreement to do with climate change adopted 2 targets below which we should keep the increases in atmospheric temperature rise, or 1.5 degrees, or the worst case, a 2-degree increase in temperature change. This data here shows the outcomes of modeling various strategies of reducing agricultural contributions to those climate change, or really food systems rather than just agriculture. Business as usual, the black bar on the left shows that we're in a great danger of hitting and exceeding that 2-degree change in climate. Then there are 2 other groups. The green group are to do with dietary change, so societal changes in the way we eat, either towards particularly plant-rich diets or adopting healthy intake of calories. What I want to concentrate on are the predictions in blue, which are associated with on-farm strategies to do with food system greenhouse gas emissions. That of, on the very left, the blue, dark blue, of breeding and adopting high-yielding crops and livestock. In the middle, of reducing food waste by half, and on the right, in the light blue, of managing and creating highly efficient agricultural systems. Of those 3 on-farm strategies, you'll see that the one that gets closest to limiting future climate change to 1.5 degrees is the creation and adoption of high efficiency farming. So clearly the most appropriate and the most likely successful approach in the future for getting to net zero and tackling any future food system contribution to climate change is associated with the use and development and broad application of high efficiency agricultural practice. Now, when it comes to thinking about how to create these high efficient agricultural systems, we know that there's a clear link between soil organic carbon and the efficiency with which nutrients are used in soil systems. And this is largely dictated by the relationship between organic carbon and the structure, particularly the pore network that is developed in soil by the microbial activity breaking down that carbon, and then that carbon acting as glue to hold soil particles together. Now, what we know is that in soils, particularly soils that have a high or a reasonable clay content, the more organic carbon that is put into those soils, the more highly developed these pore networks are. And these pore networks allow the movement of nutrients and oxygen, as well as a greater water holding capacity in those soils. Now, this develops, of course, resilience to drought during very dry periods, but also this movement of oxygen through the system controls the relative anoxic pore space in those soils across a broad range of water saturation. And we know that soils that have a very well developed and highly connected pore network have relatively low anoxic proportions, even when the soils are relatively highly saturated, particularly compared to soils and arable soils, particularly which have very low organic carbon contents, have a relatively much higher anoxic proportion, even at field capacity. Now, the reason why this is so important is this dictates microbial respiration. The greater the anoxic proportion in the soil, the more microbes have to resort to anaerobic respiration. And under those circumstances, any nitrates that they can get hold of are very rapidly converted to nitrous oxide. So first of all, that lack of efficiency means a greater emission of nitrous oxide, contributing to greenhouse gases and climate change. And secondly, that loss of nitrous oxide from the system means that nitrogen never finds its way to crop plants. And we know that only about 48 to 61% of nitrogen added in agricultural systems, particularly poorly structured arable systems, ever makes its way to a crop plant. So there's already great inefficiency in the way that we manage these systems. And we know we can manipulate that efficiency by adding organic carbon to the system. So to summarize, we know that generating highly efficient agricultural systems from the point of view of nutrient use is the most effective way to limit any future temperature increases arising from our food systems. We know that this is largely derived from reducing the nitrous oxide emissions from soils in our systems, and that we can do this by incorporating organic matter in soil, as there's a clear relationship between the amount of organic matter, the good open textured porosity generated in soil, and the reduction of nitrous oxide in those systems. But what do we know about how much carbon can be stored in soil? How does soil texture and the way we manage it influence the amount of carbon in our soils? So this data I want to show you was generated from a large survey of agricultural soils in Cornwall. So this is quite closely related to where we are in the Ruby country. And the data was collected from a broad range of land use types, soil types, management, etc. So the first thing, and I already alluded to this earlier, was that we know that the amount of clay present in soils is very closely related to the amount of carbon that can be sequestered in there. The more clay, the more carbon is sequestered in soil. As you move away from clay and clay loam soils to sandy loam soils, the ability to capture and sequester carbon in those soils reduces. So if we're looking at the sorts of soils that we might use to our advantage to sequester soil in the future, we should think about where are clay soils, where are the clay loams on our farms, where are the clay loams in our food systems, and can we use those to sequester soil more effectively than just spraying carbon willy-nilly around all soil types and not being aware of this effect of soil texture upon organic carbon matter or organic carbon sequestration. Now, secondly, the way we manage our soils also has a significant and clear influence upon the amount of soil organic matter or sequestered carbon in those soils. So tillage is the main issue here, and we know that grasslands, when they're converted to arable croplands, lose on average about 36% of their soil organic carbon over the next 20 years of arable management. So if we assume that an average starting grassland soil contains about 115 tons of carbon per hectare, over that next 20 years of arable management, it's losing about 41 tons of carbon per hectare. And there's a clear linear relationship, and this is again from that collection of Cornish soils, there's a clear linear relationship between the time period since last tillage and the amount of organic matter or organic carbon sequestered in those soils. So tillage is a really important consideration to think about when we're looking towards the future of net zero. And we know from our own work on the Northwick Farm platform that permanent pastures consistently contain greater amounts of organic carbon in their soils than improved pastures that are tilled every 3 or 4 years, tilled and reseeded. So although the example I gave about organic carbon losses is from arable systems, ploughing and reseeding of pastures also has this same influence upon carbon loss from the soils. So the soil texture and the way we manage our soils both have a really strong influence upon organic carbon sequestration in our soils. And I should add, also upon the structures that develop in those soils. The less organic carbon, remember, the less good, well-connected pore networks are developed in those soils. But we also know that organic carbon does not accumulate in soil forever. In fact, each soil texture management combination has its own maximum amount of organic carbon that it can sequester. And it does this over a long period of time. So the example I've got here is of a long-term arable soil that was converted over 170 years ago to a pasture land that was grazed by sheep. And if you look at the trend in the way that organic carbon accumulates in those soils, you'll see that it, over the first 20 to 60 years, accumulates quite rapidly. But then after about 100 years of continuous pasture management, the rate at which organic carbon continues to be increased and sequestered in those soils gradually reduces until it reaches something close to a plateau. And we see this phenomenon in soils as they move from one management type to another. There's initially a very rapid change and then a much slower period of approaching some sort of stable equilibrium of organic carbon in the soils. Now, this phenomenon of gradually saturating organic carbon in soil has real implications for how we think about net zero and how we can use soils to approach that net zero on our farms. This is data, again, from another Rothamsted long-term experiment from a pasture that up until 1880 had been managed as a pasture for over 100 years. And then in 1880, some plots on that field were amended every 4 years with 35 tonnes per hectare of farmyard manure, and others were left with no additions. Now, over the period between 1880 and 2002, when this data runs, although there were very gradual increases in the amount of soil organic carbon in those soils on both the pastures that were receiving no additions and those that were receiving farmyard manure additions, the actual increases in carbon derived from the additions of farmyard manure are extremely limited, effectively because the soil was already saturated with organic carbon before those additions started. So for those of you that have pastures that have been pastures for long periods of time, although you may be adding organic matter to those soils and assuming that there's a net accumulation of organic matter in those soils, this may not be the case. So adding organic matter to pastures that have been managed over a long period of time may not be the most optimum way of achieving net zero on your farm. Tillage may significantly reduce the organic carbon stocks in soil, but we know that adding organic matter to tilled soils makes a big difference to system efficiency and increases organic carbon sequestration. The data on this slide was generated from another of Rothamsted's long-term experiments. In this case, an arable system that for 170 years has been managed in a consistent way to compare the efficiency and the effects of different combinations of inorganic fertilizer with systems receiving 35 tonnes per hectare of farmyard manure annually, but all the systems are tilled. After this length of consistent management, the soil amended with farmyard manure contains about 80 tonnes per hectare of organic carbon. And this compares very similarly to the soils of unmanaged woodland and grassland. Alternatively, the soils managed using inorganic fertilizer contain only about 30 tonnes per hectare. So there's a significant difference in the amount of organic carbon sequestered in these soils. The effect is that the farmyard manure has developed a much more open, highly connected pore space, and in fact, in many ways, it's indistinguishable from the structure that is present in grassland and woodland. So despite the annual disruption by tillage, the structure overcomes this by the addition of so much organic matter in the system. This results in a much more oxygenated system across a whole range of water saturations, going from very dry soils on the right to very saturated soils on the left. And the farmyard manure has a much greater proportion of oxic space compared to the inorganically fertilized soils. Now you'll remember from a previous slide that the production of nitrous oxide in soil is associated with anoxic pore space. And so the fact that inorganic fertilized soils contain a much higher anoxic pore space compared to farmyard manure amended soils means that when we measure nitrous oxide emission in the field, we find significantly less nitrous oxide is lost from farmyard manure amended soils, despite the fact that farmyard manure amended soils are receiving equivalent amounts of total nitrogen to soils that receive 240 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. Although, of course, this total nitrogen is in a very different form between the inorganically fertilized and the farmyard manure amended soils. When we compare the distribution of nitrogen in these systems between that harvested in the crop, represented in green here, with that accumulating in soil, represented in brown, and that lost to the atmosphere as nitrous oxide in grey, we see that there's a distinctly different distribution of nitrogen in inorganically fertilized plots, those 3 data sets on the left, with soil that receives farmyard manure amendment on the right. So we're not only increasing the organic carbon content in the soil and reducing the amount of nitrous oxide lost to the atmosphere, but we're fundamentally changing the way nitrogen is stored and compartmentalized in farmyard manure amended arable systems. So, to summarize, creating high efficiency farming systems today is an effective approach to limiting farming's contribution to future climate change. Now, this high efficiency farming system is dependent upon organic carbon input, so achieving net zero by sequestering more carbon in soil has the co-benefit of creating these more efficient systems, and effectively by reducing the amount of nitrous oxide lost to the atmosphere and increasing, therefore, the amount of nitrogen available for crops. But we have to understand that we need to use the carbon we have in a very clever fashion, and using it in those soils that are most likely to be good sinks for organic carbon. Soils that have been managed as pastures for long periods of time are unlikely to be an effective sink for organic carbon. And we may have to use tilled or arable systems in the Ruby country as the most effective places to use to sequester organic carbon in the region's farming.